In this section, we're going to see how we can configure containerized Java applications. We're going to see what aspects we need to configure in enterprise applications, and then how to configure both containerized application servers and applications. Then lastly, we're going to see how we can communicate in Docker networks. So the first video is about what to configure in enterprise applications. We're going to see what type of configuration are there, and what the differences between static and dynamic configuration, and then finally how to configure application servers and applications. So for application servers, there are a couple of aspects to configure. We have data sources, we have all kind of credentials, for example, to connect against data sources or message queues. We have all kind of pooling for connection pooling or thread pools that we can configure, and so on and so forth. For application, this looks like more on a business level. We sometimes configure database connections, or we reuse the data sources on the application servers. Then we need to configure the external systems that we want to talk to. We sometimes need to configure credentials and so-called environment-specific behavior if our application has to behave differently when it's deployed to different environments, and also other dynamic behavior that depends on our domain. So let's look into our coffee shop example. We now have a little bit extended example here rather than just our hello world example. So for now we can, basically take coffee orders that will be placed, that will be created, which are then, just briefly stored to a database. And also we access an external system that is called a coffee shop processor that processes the status of our orders. So basically we store the coffee orders in a database, and with a timed scheduled job, we submit these processes to a processor, to an external system via HTTP. So what aspects need to be configured here? First of all, in our server configuration, in our application server, here we define a data source. We define and configure a default data source that for us connects against the Postgres database. Similarly, we have to configure the connections to that data source and also the credentials with username and password. Of course, our application server needs to be prepared for that. In this case, it means we have the driver installed as a library that is able to connect against the database. So all of this needs to be there in the application server, and ultimately needs to be in the Docker base image as well. So therefore we enhance the configuration to also include the library for our Postgres driver. Then we have a properties file within our application. We have a couple of things configured. First of all, a URL for the order processor system. Then also credentials, username and password that we use to connect against that system. And then an environment specific value that here will be the region, whatever that means on our application coffee shop. That is also configurable and could be changed when the application is deployed to several environments. Then we have our persistence XML. This is also a configuration file, but in our case it will not change, since in this case we are relying on the default data source of the application server, and therefore we don't need to configure anything. If we had several data sources, several databases connected in our application, then we would need to specify these data sources individually with multiple persistence units. So here you already see a couple of typical examples that could be configured. So this is of course not ideal yet. We need to configure this as part of this section. First of all, initially we want to differ between static and dynamic configuration. If we have static configuration, that basically means anything that we can put into our Docker image which will not be changed later on. For example, some configuration values for our application server that will not be changed neither at runtime nor at after build time. So basically neither during runtime or also not at application startup. Or we have dynamic configuration that now can be configured, for example, at application startup. That means if we had several environments, we take the same Docker image and configure it individually. or we even have some runtime specific configuration that may change while our application is running. Ideally, we have our Docker image that is built once and then shipped to all the environments and will not be changed later on. That is very important, so we always can rely that the thing that we tested in our system test also goes to production and will behave accordingly. So that means we want to put as much as static configuration as possible into our Docker image and do not change that Docker image except those things that will be different on the individual environments, usually credentials or environment specific behavior.